This is Leadership Happens, where we engage CEOs, business owners, and functional leaders as they share their philosophies and leadership lessons on managing teams and inspiring their group. Our goal is to work together to figure out the right formula for becoming an inspiring and impactful leader in today's business climate. I'm your host, Ken Schmitt, CEO and founder of Turning Point Executive Search and author of The Practical Optimist. My guest today is Sid Vivek, CEO of Junior Achievement San Diego. I've known Sid for over 5 years, and he's probably one of the most visible and vulnerable CEOs I've ever met. You might think that leading a nonprofit is a piece of cake compared to running a for-profit company, but as you'll hear from Sid today, leadership is leadership, with the same challenges, opportunities, staffing issues, and social pressures, no matter what your corporate structure happens to be. After starting his career in the legal world with aspirations of working in government policy, Sid left his role working for a congressman on Capitol Hill to impact the world of after-school care and early education with YMCA San Diego. He then joined Junior Achievement as their CEO, providing financial and career literacy to the San Diego community. Prepare to be schooled by Sid Vivek of Junior Achievement as we move through the intersection of leadership and life. I'm excited for our guest today, is Sid Vivek, who I've known for quite a while, who's here in San Diego with me as well. So welcome, Sid.
Well, Ken, thanks for having.
Yeah, and Sid and I met actually, I guess it's been about 6 or so years ago when he first came on board as the CEO, Executive Director over at Junior Achievement here in San Diego. And we've been doing a lot of work together. I was a volunteer. I was on the board of JA for a long time and just had some great experience with that organization. And I'm glad we have a chance to sit down and talk about kind of where you're at right now as a group, as an organization, as a charity group as well, as a nonprofit, but also just in terms of leadership, right? We talk to a lot of leaders out there that are in for-profit corporate world environments, and people tend to think that, a nonprofit leadership role is so much different, right? Because it's nonprofit. How hard can it be? But the reality is the word nonprofit is really just a focus on a different tax treatment. But for all intents and purposes, the actual corporate role itself is exactly the same. It doesn't matter, where you happen to be. So I'm excited to talk about that today. It'll be fun.
Well, and I think you hit it on the head. So I'm excited to get into that as well.
Yeah, very good, very good. And I want to really kind of focus our efforts in the beginning here talking about a segment that we call kind of the do-overs and do-agains, right? One of the things that we really focus on in this podcast is, leadership is to a certain extent things that you are doing and you're controlling, but to another extent is things that happen to you that are out of your control. And when that happens, mistakes get made, right? And we're all not going to be perfect and infallible when it comes to it. I certainly know I've made a lot of mistakes on my own as the leader of my company as well. So let's talk about that. So let's jump into what I call kind of the do-overs and do-agains. Let's start with, what kind of lessons come to mind for you, Sid, in terms of things that you wish you could do over, that you kind of can show up differently as a leader in the past?
Well, there's so many do-overs. I'm still working on the do-agains, but I think biggest thing for me would be, I would say in terms of career pathway, not every step forward not every step up is a step forward. And I think, and when I was younger in my career, I spent a lot of time thinking about how I could get the next pay raise or the next title. And those are important. But I think if I look back, I would say what I would do again is spend more time thinking about my ultimate destination as opposed to the stop in front of me. So that's certainly one do-over. There's many. I think there is a lot of really smart people that when I was younger, I really thought I was smarter than. And I think the do-again that I would say is in that vein, I would keep listening. I was fortunate to have some really amazing leaders in my life and people who have been mentors. And as the cycle of life changes, you have different mentors for different things. And I would listen more. I guess it's both a do-over and a do-again. I would listen more then, and I want to keep listening now.
That's a great combination. I love that. Well, I think, so I've been in the recruiting business now for 26 years. I started Turning Point Executive Search, my company, 16 years ago. And, one of the things I've learned time and time again, as somebody who partners with leaders, is that there's no one way to do it, right? There are different paths. I mean, there's not A plus B equals C. There's different paths to leadership, but the one common denominator among all the leaders that I think have been effective is listening, to your point, right? Listening when you're in the moment and being present and being aware and being part of the conversation, but not just waiting to talk. It's not just, you're actually not listening only, you're also hearing. you're really digesting and really reflecting on what people are saying to you as well. And it's much easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. And I think sometimes there's a fallacy that when you are leading people, and again, I think leadership happens at every level. It's not a title-based thing. And so whether you are an individual contributor who doesn't have anyone reporting, you can still lead, whether formally or informally. And I think, to me, leadership is about how we're moving people forward. I think sometimes we get in our head because we have a certain title, that I have all the answers. I'm the CEO, so I know what's best, and everyone has to listen to me. And gosh, that is the worst place to be, because most often the best ideas and the best execution come from those on the ground doing the work. And I think those of us who are in positions that start to oversee more people, you get further from the work in whatever, again, as you noted, whether it's nonprofit or otherwise. And I think relying on the people around us, our teammates, going back to the listening, I mean, I think that's often the most effective form of leadership. To me, leadership is how do we get everyone in the right seats, making sure that their skill sets and competencies are being leveraged towards a common goal. So are we all in the right seats? Do we all know the common goal? And what do we all need? Gary Ridge and Ken Blanchard do a great job in leadership on servant leadership. So often leading is from behind. It's what do everyone else need to get to where we want to go?
No, I agree completely. And I think, that's right there, that's kind of self-awareness, as I call it, as a leader, is so important, because there are those leaders that, their ultimate goal from day one when they come out of college, I want to be a CEO of a public company, of a tech company, whatever it might be. And they're just driving for 5, 10, 20, whatever years to get to that point. And they're not remembering about what's going to help them get there. And they're also not acknowledging the folks that are around them. One of the things as a recruiter that we look at when we're screening candidates, for example, if we're talking to somebody and everything that they talk about that's positive, it's always I. And the things that are negative, it's always they, right? That's not a good thing, right? So you've got to have that self-awareness and own things that don't go your way, and acknowledge the team around you when things are going well.
It's so true. And I always think of it, if you look at an org chart, there is a lot of other positions. Maybe there's one or there's two or there's three, but there's a lot of other positions. There's one CEO. And if I look at that org chart, I think, gosh, you could get rid of that CEO and this business would still run. But if you got rid of everybody else and there was just a CEO, we'd be in a lot of trouble. So
that's a really good point.
So in some
remembering how important you actually are.
Oh, absolutely. You are only as good as everyone else around you.
Right. Yeah. So to that point, and there's a lot of discussion out there in the HR recruiting world these days around, how do you kind of stay involved and engage with your employees, especially with the younger generation, Gen Zs, right? The whole idea of org charts and hierarchy and only going to your immediate boss and never beyond that, and being patient and waiting around for your career to evolve. That's kind of out the window, right? Gen Zers, they have no problem with talking to people all over the organization, and that's a good thing because they're going to learn from all those folks also. But what that requires is a change in terms of leadership development, but also in terms of leadership engagement. And the years of having once a year annual review, let's all sit down, right? And I'm going to talk to you for an hour. What can I do differently as your boss? And what do you think you're doing well and not so well? Those days are kind of gone. And we now have this, what we call our career conversations, where it might be once a month, once a quarter. Doesn't need to be a full-blown half-a-day kind of session, but just kind of checking in with your team and saying, hey, how are things going? How do you think you're doing? What can we as a group do to better support you? Where do you want to go with your career? I'm curious about how Junior Achievement handles that in terms of that engagement with your employees.
Yeah, well, and to hit on one of your points about the annual review, in our mind, and I say our because we came up with this process as a team. This is not one person, but in our mind, an annual review is to discuss compensation adjustment. Otherwise, all the things that we're going to talk about are your performance. Hopefully, we have done multiple times over the course of the year. Whether it's all the good things you're doing or the places to improve, hopefully those are happening in the moment. And I think that that's true at all levels. To your point, I think it's a good thing with this generation. I think they are more aware and empowered of their options and of their needs and what they want to happen. And I think as leaders, we got to lean into that. I think they bring so much experience. They've got a lot to learn, but they've got a lot of experience that those of us who aren't digital natives don't have necessarily. And I think of just technology alone, as you look at the increasing importance technology has in all of our businesses. Again, as you rightly noted, it's just a tax designation, but we're in the social sector, and technology affects the work that we do with young people as well. So, I'm not the right person to manage social media and our technology capabilities, but some of them are. And so how do we lean into the things that they want, that they need, that they're passionate about? Because I ultimately think that's good for the business.
That's a great point. And I think, it's to your point earlier also about listening to the folks that are around you. I call that kind of, bottom-up management, right? Because again, every generation has a different set of skills and knowledge based on their experience, how they grew up and how they came through the early part of their career. And I think the digital natives, right, that are the Gen Zers, the ones that are up to age 25, 26 right now, they have so much to offer in different ways. And they want mentorship. They hunger for that learning and that development also. But we as leaders have to listen to them and allow that bottom-up, type of approach to take place. So again, I'm here today with Sid Vivek, who is the CEO of Junior Achievement here in San Diego, known each other for quite a while. Sid, why don't you spend a minute or two just to kind of give us a synopsis of what Junior Achievement is all about, and why people understand very quickly why I'm so passionate about it as well.
Well, I want to start by saying thank you, Ken, for your volunteerism and service on our board many years ago and for many years. As you well know, Junior Achievement is really about preparing young people for future economic success. In a lot of ways, we spend our time thinking through and working with and creating experiences, real-world experiences that help young people understand what they're learning in the classroom, how does it apply for their future careers. So we focus on 3 pillars: financial literacy, work and career readiness, and then entrepreneurship. And not that everyone will become an entrepreneur like you, Ken, but the skills that you learn in building a company are transferable across industries and functions. And so we spend a lot of time with our young people as early as kindergarten, believe it or not, and as old as 25. How do we make sure that tomorrow's workforce, tomorrow's business leaders are prepared today?
Well, and speaking of preparation, I know that you started your career in a very different spot, right? You didn't kind of go into college and think, I'm going to come out and my goal is to become the executive director and CEO of a nonprofit. You started kind of more on the political side, right, with the goal of being on Capitol Hill, which you did. How did you kind of get there, if you will? How did you, or maybe the better question is, when did you realize that maybe a better path was not through the political system, but through more kind of a nonprofit, kind of a trajectory, if you will?
Well, I will tell you honestly, I didn't have a plan. To your point, it's probably, maybe that's why it's so disjointed. But I was doing what I was passionate about in the moment. And that led me, as you noted, from Boston, where I grew up, to D.C., where I went to college and then worked for a member of Congress and in the lobbying and advocacy industry. And ultimately led me to San Diego and the YMCA, where I was before JA, because I grew up in an after-school program and I saw young people like myself, and then that became more important to me. So I have my interest and passion in politics and policy hasn't waned, but I would say none of us are singularly focused. We're multidimensional, and at different points in my life, different things caught my eye, and I started down that path. And to that end, I would say, I think most of us would agree that life is not linear. Maybe some take larger exits or larger detours than others, but it's not linear. And I think my career is pretty is a good example of that, I think.
And to that point, then, how do you gauge when you hire somebody new, right, at Junior Achievement, and they might come in as a marketing assistant or someone on the volunteer, the program side, or membership, whatever it might be? How do you engage with them or identify where you think they might be able to go, right, in terms of their longer term goals? Do you tease that out of them in the beginning and try and kind of track that over their time with JA? How does that process happen in that leadership perspective?
I think there's certainly a discussion on the front end. I mean, we post positions with functions in mind that need to be accomplished. But ultimately, we're not hiring positions, we're hiring people. And people have a diverse set of skills and competencies that is not always obvious on the front end. And I think it's easy for us to get locked in on, I need job A done. Here are the functions of job A. Who does that on their resume or in their interview? Who discusses that? And I think it's, for us, we've taken a little bit of a broader approach because have had no problem taking an org chart and changing it as people say, gosh, I'm really interested in this part of the business. Or they show not just a passion, but a proficiency in something that they weren't hired for, but that the business needs. So we've been fortunate. Again, we're not a huge organization. We've got 30 employees, but we've been fortunate to move people and have had that move. Several of our folks that we hired 3 years ago are in different positions than they were hired for. But I also think that's good for the employee and is good for the business. Obviously, there are things you need to get done from a functional standpoint. But I think if we listen to our employees, if we listen to our teammates, and we put them in positions, it goes back to if we put them on positions on the bus where they're happy and their skill sets are leveraged. And oh, by the way, that can change. You can move on the bus. Unlike when we were kids, it's okay to move while the bus is moving because that only helps the business, and I think it keeps it fresh for employees. They want to stay. Ultimately, if you're a high performer, if you're in role X or role Y, while they're both important, you're still with the organization. We are leveraging your talents, and you are growing as an individual, and I think that that's good for all.
And the individuals that you have that are, let's say, not Gen Z, one of the great things I think about, in nonprofit organizations, it's, obviously by design and by definition, it's mission-driven. And so a lot of the people that are working for any nonprofit out there is also based on their mission, right? Which is probably a blessing and a curse if I'm making a guess here, but because you've got some people that they're not there because they want to make $1 gazillion. They know there's probably more money to be made in the private sector, but they're there because they really believe in what you're all about. Then you've got, and that's the good part of it. But the flip side potentially could be somebody who's there because they might think that being a nonprofit is a more cushy job, right? Maybe there's not as much accountability or as much focus or as much need to really have that career development. How do you balance that? How do you balance the good and the bad of having employees that are mission driven?
I think you hit it on the head. It's a balance. We run as a business. We talk about it as a business. We candidly put up the financials every month so everyone on the team can see how we're doing. Because while we are driven by mission, there's a common phrase in the social sector, there's no mission without money. And at the same time, money follows the mission. So we have to be, in many ways, the mission is our North Star. We are driven by the mission, but we're steering with money. It still takes money to do the things we need to do. So we have to absolutely balance both. One can't happen without the other. And so I think it's a reminder that the mission has to be a part of everything we do. It has to be the North Star. But the economics also matter. It's going to determine how much or how little we can do. And we try to keep reminding everyone of that balance.
Well, I love what you talked about. You used the word transparency also, where you put your financials up, people know about it. I don't think that's very common even in the for-profit world, but that's how I run my business also. But a lot of the folks that I have on my team will say, Ken, this is not the way I've experienced my other employers previously, where they rarely knew what was going on behind the scenes. But to your point, I want them to know, hey, when things are going well, here's why they're going well. The analysis, the focus on customers and clients, and why we're getting certain fees from some and not from others. And then when things are not going well, they're also privy to that. So they know if we have to cut back, or maybe there's not a bonus this quarter, what have you. How is that something that you brought into JA as part of your leadership approach?
It's something that a mentor did for me years ago, and I was on the team, and they would regularly show the team the financials. And you said it well. It helps everyone understand why we're cutting back or why we're driving forward. It helps us understand when we have to pivot or we start to explore new initiatives or opportunities. So to me, it's important. I got that from someone else. What do they say? Flattery, imitation is the best form of flattery.
Exactly.
I got it from a great leader, and I hope that, and we tell our team, I hope that when all of them get to their next place, wherever it is, whether internally or at another organization, I hope that they keep that in mind. And I hope more people do that.
And to that point, is there any kind of either formal or informal, kind of mentorship program with folks, regardless of kind of what their age is or where they are in their career, but more junior people within the organization, newer to the organization, pairing up with folks that are more seasoned within JA?
Yeah, we have that naturally because the nature of our business, we encourage our employees to volunteer in our programs, to attend our programmatic events. So what you have often are folks across the business interacting with each other, which I think is very positive. The other thing is, as a nonprofit and as is required by both the IRS and the state of California, we have a board of directors. And the board are really people like you, entrepreneurs and C-suite level executives from around San Diego's business community. They often serve as mentors for our staff with tremendous experience that they have. We've got people of all ages are able to benefit from their experiences in a way that you otherwise wouldn't get a chance to connect with the CEO of a large credit union or the CFO of one of the big publicly traded companies in town. But in the nature of our business at Junior Achievement, our staff get to interact with folks like that.
That's great. And I think one of the things that I've always been impressed by JA, one of the reasons I've been involved for so many years now, is that it's such a broad community is served, right? It's not just one region from a geographic perspective. It's also not just one socioeconomic group either. It's pretty broad. But with that, I would imagine brings the need to balance a lot of different social issues. One of the things I talk to a lot of my clients about, and even peers of mine, is the changing role of a leader, of a CEO, right, based on social issues out there, right? Obviously, since George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all the things that happened in early 2020, and then you had all the disparity that was uncovered and a spotlight shown on it during COVID as well. Leaders these days, small companies, large companies, public, private, nonprofit, it doesn't matter. Leaders are really expected to take a stance on a lot of social issues when even 5-10 years ago, that was still kind of taboo. How do you balance that with all the myriad of social issues that are out there that you are covering and affecting in the JA mission?
Yeah, I think some things, like we don't take political sides. We are nonpartisan and completely politically agnostic as it relates to the electoral system. I think George Floyd getting murdered was not a political issue, and I look at things like that as not. I don't want to say it's not hard, but it's easy to come out and say, "Wow, that's horrible." There is a societal issue that is highlighting, because let's remember George Floyd was one man, but he's not the only person that has suffered a fate like he did, a horrific fate like he did. So for us, it's a part of our mission. I go back to our job is to empower young people, and if we find overwhelmingly, the data tells us that some communities, whether it's racial, whether it's gender-based, whether it's geographic, if we understand that some communities are being historically marginalized, and the data shows that, that doesn't suggest to me that it's political. That suggests we have a policy issue. This is societal, and we have a role to play. I think public, private, philanthropic, government, we have a role to play. NGOs, we have a role to play in addressing those issues. And so I think it's a balance when it comes to potentially political issues, but I don't see this as a challenge. I use George Floyd because you brought that up specifically. That one to me is not hard to come out and say that's not okay, and what's our role to play in it, I think is really the goal. How can we, and for us, it's around the economics. How do we ensure that more people of color, that more people that look like George Floyd are not in that situation, right? So there's a whole policy piece that goes around policing and how we, that's not where we play. So, but I know that that's wrong. And I think we can organizationally say that's not okay.
As a human being, we all know that's wrong.
We know that that's wrong, exactly. Organizationally, we work on youth. How do we help young people understand how the system works, how money works? So while we serve everyone, and we do, we 100% prioritize and say, gosh, who needs us the most? And in a lot of our communities, that's young people of color, that's women, that's our Native American population. So those exist. The facts tell us that, and so we use that data to drive where we put our limited resources.
Do you have any? Is there a formal committee internally, or is there a piece of the board that talks about when kind of preparing for issues that might come up? Not when it happens, but even beforehand, saying, if something around this comes up, here's how we're going to respond. or I guess also in the moment if something really unusual pops up last minute, how are those things handled and communicated?
And we have we have a large board, but we have a subset, an executive committee of 8 to 10 people who are past board chairs, but who are also, like I said, CEOs and leaders in their respective industries, who in many cases are dealing with very similar issues in their own businesses. So it's again, I feel really fortunate and lucky to have that sort of brain power and situational leadership in the room where we do discuss those things.
That's great. One of the things that you and I have spoken about, not just in preparation for today's conversation, but in the past also is, what I call kind of the traditional versus non-traditional hire, right? And we, like I said, I've been recruiting for 26 years. We've had a lot of folks that we've placed in jobs, presidents, CEOs, as well as folks that are head of marketing and sales, some of which have traditional 4-year degrees, some of which don't, right? And there, the college degree, not to besmirch that. My youngest son obviously is finishing up his 4th year at IU right now, so it's important to have that, right? If you're listening, Corey, get that degree, finish it up. But beyond that, in terms of we're trying to find the value or figure out how much weight to put in a traditional education background for a candidate you might be considering versus not. How do you go about that? How does that factor into when you're putting a profile together to hire a new position?
Yeah, so one, I think that college is important. My kids are 12 and 8, so I hope they're listening as well.
We've got to make sure we're both clear about this.
Right.
We're not saying don't go to school.
No.
Yeah.
And I think there will always be value for a college degree. There's no question.
Right.
And my parents instilled that. It was true when I went to college, and I think it will be true when my kids go to college. Within that, though, I think if we're honest as employers, we should understand how do we leverage that experience for the role that we want done. And I think in the past, as an example, requiring a bachelor, a BA or a BS, requiring it was a way to weed people out.
Exactly.
And I think in many ways that it's almost a deficit mindset versus an asset mindset. So rather than weed people out, don't we want to include more people? That makes the pool bigger, makes our opportunity to choose the right candidate bigger. So for certain roles, if you're hiring a controller and you need a CPA, well, you need a CPA. That's a given. That's a given, right? You want to hire a lawyer, you got to have a JD and pass the bar. But for other roles, especially in an organization like ours, you're not learning everything from a college degree. Working with young people or again, working in communities of color, working with young people with developmental disability. Some of that you can learn in school and have a degree and have taken courses for, but some of it is innate. Some of it is inherent that you hopefully find out through experience and conversation. So we have, number one, for those positions that don't have a specialized requirement as it relates to a CPA or a law degree, we've removed the BA/BS requirement. We don't have that, but we do have experience requirements. We do have other very specific competency-based requirements. Can you do X? Can you do Y? But for those positions, we've removed it, and we haven't seen a fall off in the quality of our candidates, candidly. So I think there's a place for those requirements, but I think we should be honest about where and how broadly we put that on there. Just blatantly putting on every single role that we have, I think is counterproductive.
I agree completely. And it's amazing how, like I said, having done this for so many years on the recruiting side, and you see the job description, it's just recycled from the one that was replaced, 5 years ago and 10 years before that. There's no real updating of it, right, in terms of what's needed out there. I'm also amazed by how often I talk to clients and companies where they have a very concerted effort to focus on hiring more diverse, team members, which is great. And yet you look at their job descriptions, right, and the wording and the language that they use, and the 4-year degree is always required. Well, we all know that the percentage of the African American or Hispanic population that has a 4-year degree is way less than the white population. So that's one limiting factor. Then they have language in the job description, like words like driven and bold and aggressive and go-getter and hunter, which we all know tends to turn off female candidates. So now you're putting things in your job description that you probably didn't realize, honestly, that it was making an impact. but it's having a negative impact on the pool of candidates that you're attracting to even have the conversation with. So those things have to be obviously reconciled.
Yeah, and you said it. Sometimes it's not intentional, but the practical result is that you're leaving people out, and it's only going to hurt you, you as the employer. So I think you're spot on in that the way in which, and this is where you go back to, talent is equally dispersed, opportunity is not, and I think it's up to all of us as employers, regardless of sector, to. Yes, it's more work. Yes, but that work is worth it. And let's lean in and say, gosh, what are the things that are unintentionally or intentionally keeping people out when we should be wanting them to come in?
Right. To your point earlier about, rather than using the job description to weed people out, let's, again, start from a focus of more abundance, and let's try to include as many folks as possible and then talk to them all and figure out who the best fit is, rather than trying to, kind of limit the pool. Let's increase the pool instead. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something else that comes up a lot with the leaders that I talk to. And that's around kind of, I joke, but it's kind of the loneliness of being a leader, right? So I have a very small firm. There's 7 of us, including myself. But even as the head of this small company, it's lonely, right? Because no matter how inclusive and how transparent your business is, at the end of the day, you are the one making the decisions. And even if your team is making decisions, the final burden rests on your shoulders. Right. So I'm curious for you whether you have a peer group that you talk to. Are you part of, Vistage or those kinds of things, or even something informal? How do you, break through that loneliness as a leader, but also then how do you use that to your advantage to really kind of help you lead more effectively?
Yeah, I think so. One, my wife serves as an involuntary consigliere.
Join the club.
And she tries to get out of it all the time, but I just keep pulling her back in to stick with the consigliere
exactly right.
reference. I think I'm fortunate. I think we are fortunate in San Diego to have a really strong and well-connected, interconnected social sector. And so there are a number of other nonprofit leaders and CEOs who I feel very fortunate to have, that I get to call friends, and who I 100% lean on to have those conversations. I will also say that I feel equally fortunate to have an amazing team where you can't tell everybody everything, but I will tell you, I tell them a lot. And they are pretty amazing at providing feedback and being there for those conversations. So I think it's lonely, but I feel good that it's not lonely often. There are those moments, and in some ways, I think that's the burden of leadership. I think that's kind of you're in that seat for a reason, and I think that's something that we just all have to lean into. And understand that it's our job to do this so that our teams don't have to in some ways. But I do feel fortunate that those moments are not as often because I found such a great community of people here in San Diego.
That's great. That's a very, very well said. And I think it is a matter of, I was kind of joking with my wife. My wife is a marriage and family therapist. So much like yours, she's brought into a lot of things, and I bounce things off of her. And I'm very communicative for that reason. So I'm very grateful for it. But there are times where you have to realize, okay, I need to make a decision. I need someone to come in as well. And, whether it's a spouse or whether it's another peer from another organization, it's really important to have that also. And to that point, as a follow-on to that is, kind of the alignment of values within an organization, right? There are those organizations that their values are purely that of the leader, and it's reflected in that, right? And that follows through in terms of how the company is run and managed and financed and who does what, all those kind of things. And then there are other organizations where it's kind of the collective values of the group or the executive leadership team, and that's what kind of drives everything. How do you approach that as a leader? Would you say that JA San Diego is a reflection of certain peoples or the mission of the organization? Is it a unique flavor of what Sid believes? How do you balance those things?
Yeah, well, and I think in some ways, so you founded your company. I'm not the founder of JA,
Sure.
So I think I benefit from an existing set of mission, values, even execution. That's something that has been set for 100 years here in the U.S. and more than 70 years here in San Diego. So I feel fortunate in some ways that we're not building that from scratch. But I would say that I suspect there's aspects of what we do. There's some new programming. There's 100% a focus in certain places that are a little of my flavor. But I think it's really important as the leader of an organization that existed before you and will exist after you, that you manage that carefully. It cannot just become Sid's mouthpiece. Then something's gone wrong. So while I think I have an influence on some of those things, we have a great board of directors an independent board of directors who, they hired me and they get to fire me. And so I think in that regard, it's a really good balance in the sense that, I always check in with them. They need to be on board. Otherwise, it's not something we would do. So I think it's a good balance. And because they represent a diverse cross-section of San Diego business industry function, I think it's a pretty good balance. But I do hope in some ways that the things that I think are important are reflected in parts of what we do.
That's great. Well, and I think, to your point earlier about having, as you described, a kind of a career that kind of bounced around a little bit, right? Whether it's a jagged career or whether it's just nonlinear, whatever it might be. But I think, having the ability to ebb and flow with your, not that you're gonna relax your values, right? Your values are your values, but you're also adjusting along the way, and you're getting input from others, and you're learning, right? As a leader at age 22 or 25, you're a very different leader. We all are than when we're 45, 50, and later on beyond that. And I think having that willingness to listen, as you mentioned earlier, but also flex is super important out there also.
Well, and to that point, some things are more important to me personally than others. So those places where I think this is a deal breaker. I can't compromise on this. I haven't found that moment. I think the things that are important to me, the board has agreed with, our organization and staff have. So I think those are shared values. But I suspect that, it's why you often have leadership changes, because you probably hit that moment where there's a divergent set of values where this is uncompromising for me, and someone is saying, well, no, I need you to compromise. And I suspect that happens. I feel fortunate that hasn't happened here, and I don't anticipate that.
I hope it doesn't. Yeah,
I hope so too. But the board will be the judge of that.
Sure, that's great. When you are, I have one more question for you, then I want to kind of wrap things up. But in terms of what you are doing as a leader internally, we kind of discussed that. But being a leader externally, right? I think that is probably something that's a little bit more pronounced when you are in a nonprofit, because you're looked at by the broader community as an organization that's not just selling a product or service, but it's supporting the local community, local or national, whatever it might be, right? In your case, obviously local. How does that leadership role, right, and that title, whether it's thrust upon you or you sought it out, how do you lean into that when you're externally focused and talking to all the different collaborators and supporters of the JA mission?
Well, I think again, it's the price of leadership. So whether you like it or not, I think it's what people expect. Your community, the students you serve, the staff that you work with, your teammates. If that happens and that becomes the expectation, then I think it's something that you have to take seriously. And I think of it as a platform. I think of it as an opportunity. So if others in the community are looking to us, that means I suspect we've got something that could help out. And it's our job to find a way to do those things. And so I feel really fortunate that in those moments where our community has kind of connected and said, hey, we think JA should be doing X, I see it as my job to facilitate that. Okay, we go internally and we say, hey, how are we going to do X? And let's go get it done if that's what our community needs. I think that's the value in many ways of the social sector. While we run a business just like you and the private sector, I think we are a far more community responsive to our broader community, because it's not just a product that we serve. We are in the mission of empowering young people, and that changes over time. So we have to change with it. And that part actually, I think, is similar in the private sector. Apple doesn't keep making the same iMac it did 20 years ago. So I think in that regard, if we are called to lead individually or organizationally, then it's our job to be there.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. And I like the example, obviously, with the iMac. And, the computers that we once had. Even if you watch some of the shows from the 80s, you see the cell phones there versus the cell phones we have today. Companies are always iterating. They're always evolving, whether it's a product company, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a service company, whatever it might be, banking, you name it, right? There has to be this evolution. And I think that evolution has to also translate over to leadership. We've got to lead differently today in a work-from-home environment, in a more globally connected world. We've got to lead differently than we did, years ago.
Yeah, and we talk internally of the life cycle of a company, and we use that in our nonprofit, in our organization. We use that because when you're bootstrapping a startup, that looks very different than when you are, Series A, Series B, and you're in a different stage versus you're mature and the cycle starts again. So in a lot of ways, that is, I think, the piece in the social sector that is missing, that I think the private sector does very well. You often hear of founders being kicked out of their own companies. Hopefully it's because a board of independent directors said, gosh, I think we need something different. And I think the same is true in the social sector. I think it's easy to become rinse and repeat when, in fact, we should be responsive.
I'm sure there's a lot of folks that are listening that are going to want to learn more about junior achievement, whether it's here in San Diego or California in general or just nationally. But you, having spent your time with us today and sharing all this insight, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you to learn about the local chapter or about JA, in a broader scale?
Yeah, and it is a global organization, so I'd encourage you locally here in San Diego, it's jasandiego.org and at JA San Diego across all the social media platforms. But there is a national organization as well as a global movement. We are in several dozen countries all over the world, and it's really about getting young people prepared for their future economically. And so I would encourage people to get involved because it's usually when you say charity, you think, oh, they want our money. And while that's a piece of what we do, as you well know, Ken, as a former board of director and volunteer, it's also your engagement and people in our community connecting with young people about the age-old question of what am I going to be when I grow up? We want to help our young people see it now. And your listeners are doing that. And our goal is to have everybody involved in some way in one of our schools across the county.
Yeah, what's the expression you usually use? It's about time, talent, and resources. Is that right?
Time, talent, and treasure.
Treasure.
So we like alliteration.
Yeah. Should have realized that. Yeah. Time, talent, and treasure. And not everybody has all three to give. Yeah.
Very few have all three to give, but we need all three to get it done. And so whichever one or two you can give, we welcome that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your time today, Sid. It's been a great conversation. We could talk for another 3 hours if we had the time, but I'm sure our listeners will first of all, enjoy this. Secondly, they'll probably reach out to you for more information as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Welcome. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all that you do for our community. I know it's more than just a podcast. You are all over the place, and our community appreciates that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you.